They thought it was a trap, but it was fate. When the walls close in and the air burns, you must choose: burn alone, or let your enemy forever change your blood. The silence of Malfoy Manor was not empty. It was heavy, a suffocating weight that pressed against the eardrums like deep water. It smelled of wet stone, ancient dust, and the lingering copper tang of dark magic that no amount of ministry scrubbing could fully erase. Outside, the November rain lashed against the high, diamond-paned windows, a relentless rhythm that blurred the grounds into a watercolor of grey and black. Hermione Granger adjusted her grip on her wand, the wood slick against her damp palm. She told herself it was just the temperature. The heating charms in the East Wing had failed weeks ago, but her body knew better. It was the house. It was the way the shadows seemed to stretch toward her ankles, the way the portraits feigned sleep but watched through slit eyelids. And it was him. Draco Malfoy stood by the heavy oak doors of the library, a spectre in his own home. He hadn't spoken a word since she arrived an hour ago. He simply watched her, his grey eyes void of their old, sharp malice, replaced by a hollow, exhausted stillness that was somehow more unsettling. He wore black, as always, the fabric hanging loosely on a frame that had become too sharp, too angular. The war had ended 3 years ago, but looking at him, Hermione often felt that for Draco, the smoke had never quite cleared. "Item number 407, Hermione murmured, her voice sounding too loud in the cavernous room. She didn't look at him, focusing instead on the floating parchment beside her. Cursed opal necklace. Status: confiscated. Residue detected. She waited for a snide comment, a sigh of impatience, anything. There was only the sound of the rain and his shallow breathing. "We need to check the cellar archives," she said finally, turning to face him. The movement was sharp, defensive. The ministry sensors picked up a fluctuation in the magical core of the foundations. A dormant ward, perhaps. Draco finally moved. He pushed himself off the doorframe, his movements fluid but weary, like a man wading through invisible water. "There is nothing in the archives." His voice was rough, like gravel grinding underfoot. It was a voice unused to conversation. "Nothing but rot and the things my father forgot to burn." "The censors don't lie, Malfoy. Neither does the manor," he countered quietly. He met her gaze, and for a second the air between them crackled, not with magic, but with the old, familiar friction, the "can't stand it" that had defined their childhood. But beneath it, Hermione saw a flicker of something else. Fear? Warning? "Go home, Granger. Mark it as clear. Nobody comes down here. Nobody cares." "I care," she said, lifting her chin. It was a reflex, the need to be right, to be thorough. "And it is my job to ensure this place is safe. For everyone, including you." His mouth twisted, a ghost of a sneer that didn't reach his eyes. "Safe," he repeated, tasting the word as if it were poison. "Nothing is safe here." He turned and began to walk into the corridor, the darkness swallowing him. Hermione hesitated, a shiver tracing the line of her spine before following him. The descent into the cellars was a journey into the throat of a beast. The air grew colder with every step, the stone beneath their feet slick with condensation. The lumos from Hermione's wand cast long, dancing shadows against the walls, illuminating tapestries that had been eaten away by damp and time. They walked in silence, but the tension was a physical thing, a taut wire stretched between them. Hermione was acutely aware of him, the way his pale hair caught the wand light, the tension in his shoulders, the deliberate distance he kept from her, as if afraid that touching her would burn him, or perhaps contaminate him. She couldn't tell which prejudice remained, the one against her blood or the one against his own worthiness. Here, Draco stopped before a low, iron-bound archway. The wood was black, charred as if by fire, though it remained solid. The archive of the blood, or what's left of it. He didn't reach for the handle. He stood back, his hands thrust deep into his pockets, his posture rigid. "You're not coming in?" Hermione asked, sensing his reluctance. "The room. It doesn't like visitors," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the floor. "And it doesn't like me much these days either." Hermione frowned, her analytical mind trying to dissect his vagueness. "It's just a room, Malfoy. Just bricks and mortar." "It's a Malfoy room," he corrected, looking at her then. The intensity in his eyes stopped her breath for a second. "It remembers." Pushing aside the sudden spike of anxiety, Hermione stepped forward and pushed the heavy door open. It groaned, a sound like a dying animal, and swung inward. The room was circular, lined with stone shelves that were largely empty. In the center of the floor, etched directly into the obsidian flagstones, was a complex array of runes. They weren't glowing, but they seemed to absorb the light from her wand, drinking it in rather than reflecting it. The atmosphere here was different, static, charged, like the air before a lightning strike. Hermione stepped into the room, her eyes immediately scanning the runes. "Ancient Futhark," she whispered, her curiosity overriding her caution. "But modified, interwoven with, is that bind runes for protection?" "Preservation," Draco said from the doorway. He hadn't crossed the threshold. "It's a preservation circle. My grandfather was obsessed with the purity of the line. He created fail-safes." "It's active," Hermione noted, watching the reading on her magical sensor spike red. "The energy signature is erratic. It's pulling ambient magic from the ley lines." She took a step closer to the center, squinting at the carvings. "The syntax is wrong. Sanguis, vinculum, eternum, blood, chain, eternity. It looks like a stasis field, but the anchor is missing." "Granger, don't." The warning in his voice was sharp, cutting through her focus. She looked up. Draco had taken a step into the room, his hand outstretched, his face pale as the moon. "Don't read it," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Don't speak the words." "I wasn't. You were translating it," he accused, moving closer, his eyes darting around the shadows of the room as if expecting them to come alive. "You always have to know, don't you? You always have to understand." "It's unstable, Draco." She used his name without thinking. "If I don't stabilize the runic sequence, the build-up could collapse the foundation. If you touch it, it will wake up." "It's already awake," Hermione argued, gesturing with her wand. A spark of silver light drifted from the tip, landing on the central rune. The reaction was instantaneous. A low hum, barely audible at first, began to vibrate through the floor. It resonated in Hermione's teeth, in the marrow of her bones. The heavy iron door slammed shut with a deafening boom, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. "No," Draco breathed. Hermione spun around, rushing to the door. She grabbed the handle, pulling with all her strength. It didn't budge. She raised her wand. "Alohomora!" Nothing. The magic fizzled against the wood, absorbed instantly. Bombarda! The explosion she expected never came. Instead, the spell was sucked into the walls, the stone glowing faintly for a second before dimming again. The room was eating her magic. "Stop," Draco said. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at the floor. Hermione turned. The runes were no longer dark. They were beginning to bleed light, a deep crimson glow that pulsed in time with a heartbeat. Not her heartbeat, not Draco's. A slow, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. What is this? Hermione's voice trembled. She backed away from the center, moving until her back hit the cold stone wall. What is happening? Draco stood frozen in the middle of the distance between her and the circle. He looked terrified. It was a raw, primal fear that Hermione had never seen on him, not even during the Battle of Hogwarts. "The lockdown," he whispered. "It thinks the line is under threat. It thinks the manor is dying." "So it seals the room?" Hermione asked, her mind racing for a countercurse. "To protect the contents?" "No." Draco looked at her, and his eyes were wide, dark pools of despair. "Not the contents. The blood. It seals the air." The crimson light flared brighter, rising from the floor like smoke. It formed a barrier, a translucent wall of red energy that began to expand. It wasn't just a wall, it was a cage, and it was shrinking. "Draco! Move!" Hermione yelled. He didn't move fast enough. The barrier expanded outward, then snapped inward, catching them both. Hermione felt a sudden, wrenching pull behind her navel, as if a hook had caught her insides. She stumbled forward, pushed by an invisible force, until she was standing just inside the perimeter of the runes. Draco was forced backward from the other side, stumbling until they were both trapped inside the glowing circle, no more than 6 feet apart. The heat hit them instantly. It wasn't the warmth of a fire. It was a fever. It started in the air, a thick, humid pressure that made it hard to breathe, and then it sank into the skin. Hermione gasped, clutching at the collar of her robes. It felt as though her blood was suddenly too hot for her veins. "What is it doing?" she gasped, her legs feeling weak. She looked at Draco. He was gripping his left forearm, his face twisted in pain. He sank to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's the vinculum," he choked out. "The bond. It requires stability. How do we stop it?" Hermione dropped to her knees as well, not because she wanted to, but because the gravity in the circle seemed to have doubled. The air shimmered between them, distorting his image. "We can't," Draco grit out, sweat already beading on his forehead, sticking his pale hair to his temples. "It doesn't stop until it secures the future." "That doesn't make sense," Hermione cried out, panic rising in her throat, tasting like bile. The heat was intensifying, a slow boil. She felt a phantom burning sensation tracing lines across her skin, like invisible fingers mapping her anatomy. "We are not. I am not. This is a bloodline ritual, Malfoy. I am Muggle-born. It should trigger a defense, not a containment." Draco looked up, his grey eyes piercing through the red haze. He looked shattered. "It doesn't care about blood status, Granger," he rasped, his voice strained with the effort to remain conscious under the crushing pressure of the magic. "It cares about power. It cares about life. And you?" He swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to her chest, where her heart was hammering against her ribs. You are the strongest witch of the age. It chose you. The realization hit Hermione like a physical blow. The manor wasn't attacking her. It was claiming her. A sharp, searing pain sliced through her abdomen, bringing a scream to her lips. It felt like a brand. Across from her, Draco arched his back, a guttural cry tearing from his throat. The magic was synchronized. What she felt, he felt. "We have to break the circuit!" Hermione yelled over the rising hum of the magic. "Draco, we have to break it!" "Tried," he gasped, one hand pressed to the floor, his knuckles white. "Can't break it. Have to endure it." "It's going to kill us," she whispered, the horrifying clarity of the situation settling in. The heat was becoming unbearable. Her vision was spotting with black. The energy output is too high for two bodies to hold separately. It's going to burn us out. Draco dragged his eyes to hers. There was no hatred there anymore, no prejudice, just the terrifying vulnerability of a man watching his own execution. "I know," he said softly. The circle pulsed, a wave of agony rolling through them both. Hermione scrambled forward, instinct overriding reason. She needed to do something, anything other than die on this cold floor. She reached out, her hand trembling violently towards him. "The conduction," she stammered, her mind flashing through arithmancy equations, seeking a solution in the numbers. "If the circuit is overloaded, we have to close the loop. We can't be two separate poles. We have to ground it." Draco stared at her hand. It was suspended in the air between them, shaking. "Granger. Take my hand, Malfoy," she screamed, as another wave of fire coursed through her nerves. "We have to close the circuit." He hesitated. For a heartbeat, she thought he would rather die than touch her. She saw the war in his eyes, the conditioning, the years of programmed disgust, battling against the primal will to survive. Then he moved. He lunged forward, his movement desperate and ungraceful, and his hand clamped around hers. The moment skin touched skin, the world turned white. The agony didn't stop, but it changed. The burning fire that was consuming them individually suddenly found a path to flow. Hermione gasped, her back arching as the magic surged from her into him and back again. It was a circuit, a violent, rushing river of power connecting them. It wasn't relief, it was an invasion. She could feel him, not just his hand, but his fear, his crushing guilt, the cold, jagged shards of his soul. And she knew he could feel her terror, her desperate logic, the frantic beating of her heart. Draco pulled her closer, not out of desire, but because the magic demanded it. The further apart they were, the more it hurt. He dragged her until their knees collided, until their chests were inches apart. He was freezing cold despite the heat of the room, shivering violently. "Don't let go," he whispered, his voice broken, his forehead collapsing against hers. "Merlin, Granger, don't let go." Hermione gripped his hand so tight her nails dug into his skin. She used her other hand to grab the lapel of his robe, anchoring herself to him. They were the only two solid things in a world that was melting. "I won't," she breathed, the air between their lips sharing the same oxygen. "I won't." The red light of the ritual flared one last time, sealing them in. The outside world, the rain, the ministry, the past, ceased to exist. There was only the heat, the pain, and Draco Malfoy holding onto her as if she were the only thing keeping him from falling into the abyss. And the long, dark night had only just begun. The relief of their joined hands was momentary, a fleeting gasp of air before the water closed over their heads again. The circuit they had formed was crude, a single wire trying to channel the voltage of a lightning storm. The magic of the Malfoy bloodline, ancient and sentient in its hunger, surged through the point of contact, palm to palm, but it backed up at the wrists, at the elbows, slamming against the barriers of their own resistance. It wasn't enough. Hermione cried out as the heat spiked, a physical lash across her shoulders. It felt as though the heavy wool of her ministry robes had caught fire, though there were no flames. The air inside the rune circle had thickened into a gel, shimmering with a violent crimson haze that distorted Draco's face, turning him into a fever dream of sharp angles and terrified eyes. "It's not holding!" Draco yelled, his voice cracking. He was gripping her hand so hard she felt the bones grinding together, but the pain of his grip was nothing compared to the molten lead pumping through her veins. "Granger, it's not holding!" The surface area. Hermione gasped, her mind fracturing under the pressure. She tried to think, tried to summon the arithmancy charts she had memorized, but they were burning up like paper in a furnace. The resistance is too high. The magic, it can't flow through the obstacles. She looked down at herself. The heavy cloak, the layers of sensible clothing she wore to armor herself against the world. They were insulators. The ritual didn't understand modesty, it understood biology. It understood the raw, unadulterated conduits of life. "The clothes," she choked out, the realization horrific and undeniable. It needs skin, Draco. It needs the vessel to be open." Draco shook his head violently, sweat flying from his brow. "No," he snarled, his face twisted in a rictus of agony and denial. "I am not doing that. I am not—" A spasm of magic hit him, buckling his knees. He collapsed forward, dragging Hermione down with him. They hit the stone floor hard, but the cold of the flagstones offered no relief. The stone was vibrating, heating up from the core of the earth beneath them. Hermione landed on her side, curling in on herself as the burning sensation intensified. It felt like her skin was being peeled away, layer by layer. The magic was corrosive now, punishing them for their hesitation. "We don't have a choice," she screamed, the sound tearing at her throat. She fumbled with the clasp of her cloak, her fingers numb and clumsy. "Draco, look at me. It's burning us alive because we are fighting it." He looked at her then. He was huddled on the floor, clutching his chest, his breath coming in shallow, ragged wheezes. The grey of his eyes was swallowed by dilated pupils, blown wide by shock. He looked at her not with lust, but with the stark, animalistic panic of a creature caught in a trap. He saw the truth in her face. He felt the same fire eating his nerves. "Do it," he rasped, the words costing him everything. Hermione tore the cloak from her shoulders, casting it aside. It hit the edge of the rune circle and disintegrated into ash instantly. The message was clear. Anything that was not them was fuel. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she reached for the buttons of her outer robe. Every movement was a battle against the tremors in her muscles. She felt exposed, not just physically, but spiritually. To be this vulnerable in front of anyone was terrifying. To be this vulnerable in front of Draco Malfoy, the boy who had watched her torture, the man who represented everything that had tried to break her, was a violation that made her soul recoil. But the alternative was death. She stripped off the robe, then the cardigan beneath it, leaving her in a thin camisole and trousers. The air in the room bit at her exposed skin, strange and hot-cold, electric with the heavy charge of the ritual. Draco was struggling with his own layers. He had discarded his jacket, and now his trembling fingers were working at the buttons of his black shirt. He wasn't looking at her. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, his jaw clenched tight enough to snap bone. He was retreating inside himself, disassociating from the reality of what he had to do. When he peeled the shirt away, Hermione's breath caught in her throat. She had expected the pale, flawless skin of a pampered aristocrat. Instead, she saw a map of violence. A jagged, silvery scar slashed across his chest. Sectum sempra, she realized with a jolt of memory. And on his left arm, the dark, ugly ink of the mark stood out in stark contrast to his pallor, though it looked faded, dead. He was a ruin of a man, etched with the history of their war. "Come here," she whispered. It wasn't a request. It was a plea for salvation. Draco opened his eyes. They were dark, unguarded for the first time in his life. He crawled towards her, the movement jerky and painful. The space between them seemed to stretch for miles, filled with the ghosts of everything they had said and done to each other over the years. "If we die," he muttered, his voice thick. "I'm haunting you, Granger." It was a weak attempt at deflection, a shield made of paper. Hermione didn't smile. She reached out. This time, when they touched, it wasn't just hands. Draco collapsed against her. His bare chest hit her shoulder, his arm wrapping around her waist to steady himself. The shock of skin-on-skin contact was explosive. It was like plunging into ice water after being in a fire. The agony that had been tearing Hermione apart abruptly ceased, replaced by a sensation that was overwhelming in its intensity, but not painful. It was a rush of pure connection. She felt the beat of his heart against her ribs, frantic, bird-like. She felt the texture of his skin, damp, smooth, fever-hot. She felt the magic snap into place, the circuit closing with a satisfied hum that resonated through the floor. But the ritual wasn't satisfied with a hug. The runes flared brighter, the red light deepening to the color of arterial blood. The pressure in the room increased, pushing them down. "More!" Hermione gasped, her head falling back, her neck exposed. The magic was demanding total immersion. "It's not enough surface area. We have to ground it completely." Draco groaned, a sound of defeat. He understood. The magic needed a singular entity. It needed the illusion that they were one body. "I can't." He breathed into the curve of her neck, his body shaking against hers. "Granger, I can't." "You have to," she said, her hands coming up to grip his bare shoulders. His skin was slippery with sweat. "Draco, please." He shifted, his movements heavy and reluctant. He pushed her back until she was lying flat on the cold stone floor, the runes pulsing beneath her spine. Then he moved over her. There was a moment of hesitation, a suspended second where he hovered above her, his weight supported on his elbows, his face inches from hers. The intimacy of the position was aggressive, jarring. This was the posture of lovers, of intimacy, yet there was no softness in it. There was only desperate necessity. He lowered himself. The impact of his full weight pressing her into the stone knocked the air from her lungs. His chest pressed against hers, his hips aligning with hers, his legs tangling with hers to maximize the contact. The world dissolved. There was no more room, no more cellar, no more war. There was only him. The magic surged through them, no longer a jagged current, but a tidal wave. It flowed from the runes, through Hermione's back, into her heart, and straight into Draco. It bound them together, stitching their energies into a single, complex tapestry. Hermione gasped, her eyes flying wide, staring up at the vaulted ceiling that was swimming in her vision. She could feel his thoughts, not words, but impressions. Cold, guilt, the smell of burning, fear of the dark, the softness of her skin. She knew he could feel her too. The need for control, the terror of failing, the unexpected solidity of him. "Look at me," Draco whispered. His voice was right in her ear, a vibration that went straight to her spine. He had buried his face in the crook of her neck, hiding. "No," she breathed, her hands clutching his back, her fingers digging into the muscles of his shoulder blades. "Don't look." If they looked at each other now, with their bodies pressed together like this, with nothing between them but sweat and magic, the reality of it would shatter them. It was too much. It was too intimate. It was a transgression of every rule they had ever lived by. So they lay there in the dark, caught in the eye of the magical storm. The silence of the manor returned, but inside the circle, the air was loud with their breathing. Hermione could feel every shift of his muscles, every tremor that racked his frame as the magic stabilized, feeding off their combined life force. She became hyper-aware of the details she had never wanted to know. The way he smelled, like expensive parchment, ozone, and the sharp tang of fear. The weight of him, which was significant, grounding her to the earth. The roughness of the hair on his arms against her smooth skin. It was a forced proximity that went beyond physical boundaries. It was a melding. Minutes turned into hours. The magic ebbed and flowed, a tide of energy that demanded constant vigilance. Every time Draco tried to shift his weight, to pull away even an inch to relieve the cramp in his muscles, the burning returned, instantaneous and cruel, forcing him to collapse back onto her. "Stop moving," Hermione murmured, her voice sounding drugged, heavy with exhaustion. Her eyes were closed. She was drifting in the haze of the ritual. "I'm cramping," he gritted out, his breath hot against her collarbone. "This floor is unforgiving." "Better than burning," she whispered. "Is it?" he asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. He shifted his head slightly, his cheek resting against her shoulder. It was a gesture of surrender. The fight had drained out of him. He was no longer Draco Malfoy, the pure-blood heir. He was just a terrified man, clinging to the only source of warmth in a cold hell. "Granger?" "Yes?" "If we get out of this," he said, his voice barely a whisper, vibrating against her skin. "We never speak of it. It never happened." Hermione opened her eyes, staring up at the darkness. She could feel the steady, rhythmic thrum of the magic knitting them together, ignoring their consent, ignoring their history. It didn't care about their silence. It only cared about their survival. "It never happened," she lied, her voice hollow. But as his hand inadvertently relaxed, his fingers curling to rest against the side of her waist, and her body instinctively arched slightly to meet the contact, she knew the truth. The magic was writing this night into their very DNA, and no amount of silence would ever be able to erase the way his heart was currently beating in perfect synchronization with hers. Time lost its shape in the dark. There were no hours, no minutes, only the rhythmic, crushing expansion of the silence and the heat. The cellar, usually a tomb of cold stone, had become a womb, suffocating, pressurized, and alive. Hermione lay pinned beneath the weight of the man she had spent half her life despising, and yet the hatred was gone. It had been burned away, evaporating like water on a hot skillet, leaving behind something far more terrifying: recognition. She knew the cadence of his breathing better than her own. She knew the exact point where the tension knotted in his shoulders, just under the damp skin. She knew the way his heart stuttered when the magic flared, a frantic bird trapping itself against her ribcage. The ritual was no longer content with mere contact. It had stabilized, yes, but now it was feeding. It began as a low vibration in the base of her spine, a hum that tasted like iron in her mouth. The red light of the runes, which had dimmed to a dull ember, suddenly pulsed. Draco groaned, his head jerking up from where it had been resting in the crook of her neck. His muscles went rigid, rock hard against her softness. "It's changing," he gasped, his voice a wrecked rasp. "Granger." "I feel it," she whispered, her hands tightening reflexively on his back. Her fingers slipped on his sweat-slicked skin. The heat surged. It wasn't the external burning of before. It was internal. It felt as though a star had been ignited in her belly, heavy and molten. The sensation was invasive, a violation of her biological autonomy that made her hips buck upward instinctively, trying to escape the pressure. But the movement only pressed her firmer against him. Draco hissed through his teeth, a sound of sharp intake. The friction of their bodies, damp skin against damp skin, the rough fabric of his trousers against her legs, sent a shock wave of static electricity through them both. The magic snapped, eager and hungry. It latched onto that friction. It wanted more. "Stop moving," Draco commanded, but his voice lacked authority. It was thin, frayed by the same delirium that was clouding her vision. "I can't," Hermione panted, the air in the circle growing thin. "It feels like it's pulling. It's pulling me apart." "It's the sanguis," Draco choked out. He buried his face in her shoulder again, hiding from the light that was beginning to brighten around them. "It's looking for the anchor. It's trying to seed." Hermione's mind, usually so sharp, so guarded, was dissolving into a haze of sensory overload. Logic was failing. She couldn't think about arithmancy or countercurses. She could only think about the weight of him, the way his hips fit between hers, the terrifying reality that his body was the only thing keeping the fire from consuming her entirely. The magic flared again, a violent contraction that squeezed the air from the room. They both cried out, a harmonized sound of pain and shock. The energy arc traveled from the runes up through Hermione's back and slammed into Draco. He convulsed, his back arching, driving his weight down into her. It was an imitation of an act they had never shared, a cruel parody of intimacy orchestrated by ancient, mindless intent. "Draco," she sobbed, the name tearing out of her throat. She didn't know why she said it. Maybe to remind herself he was real. Maybe because he was the only other person in the universe. "I know," he breathed against her skin, his lips brushing the sensitive cord of her neck. "I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He wasn't fighting it anymore. He couldn't. The ritual had seized control of his motor functions, using him as the instrument. He pressed closer, eliminating every millimeter of space between them. His hands, which had been clenched in fists on the floor, moved. They slid under her, gripping her waist, pulling her flush against him until she could feel the ridge of his hip bones grinding against hers. It was intimate in a way that shattered boundaries. It was emerging. The magic swirled around them, no longer red, but a blinding, searing gold. It poured into them. Hermione felt her magical core vibrate, forced open by the sheer magnitude of the Malfoy power. It was ancient, heavy, and arrogant. It tasted of old wine and blood. It didn't ask for permission to enter her. It simply claimed the space. She gasped, her head thrown back, her eyes staring blindly at the ceiling. The sensation was overwhelming, a fullness that stretched her very soul. It was agony, and it was ecstasy, and she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Draco was drowning in it too. She could feel the tremors racking his frame, the way he fought to keep his weight from crushing her, while the magic tried to push him down. He was a conduit, a lightning rod channeling the storm into the earth, into her. "Look at me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring in her ears. He lifted his head. His face was a ruin. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his lips bitten red, his skin pale and translucent in the magical light. But it was his eyes that undid her. The grey was gone, swallowed by a black so deep it looked like the void between stars. There was no occlumency there, no mask, just raw, bleeding vulnerability. He looked at her with a mixture of awe and horror, as if he was watching a galaxy collapse. "You're burning," he murmured, his hand coming up to touch her cheek. His fingers were trembling. "So, are you," she replied. The climax of the ritual hit them without warning. The runes beneath them screamed, a high-pitched, crystalline sound that shattered the remaining silence. The golden light exploded, turning the world white. Hermione felt a sudden, visceral snap deep inside her body, a locking mechanism falling into place. It was a sensation of profound finality, like a door slamming shut, like a seal being pressed into hot wax. The breath was knocked out of her. Her back arched off the floor, her fingers digging into Draco's shoulders, her nails biting into the skin. Draco cried out, a guttural sound buried against her collarbone. The energy surged out of him, a torrent of raw magic that poured into the connection they had forged. For a second, they ceased to be two people. They were a single entity, fused by fire and blood, suspended in a moment of absolute blinding existence. There was no past, no war, no mudblood and pureblood. There was only this, the heat, the sweat, the frantic, desperate clinging to life. And then, as quickly as it had peaked, the wave broke. The blinding light collapsed inward, rushing back into the runes, back into the stone, back into them. The roar of the magic faded into a dull, throbbing hum. The pressure in the room evaporated, leaving behind a sudden, shocking cold. Draco collapsed on top of her. He was heavy, a dead weight. His breathing was ragged, harsh gasps that tore at his throat. His heart was hammering against her chest so hard she thought it might bruise her ribs. Hermione lay paralyzed, staring up into the gloom. The golden light was gone, replaced by the dim, steady glow of the dying runes. Her body felt strange, rewired. There was a lingering heat in her lower abdomen, a quiet, heavy warmth that hadn't been there before. She felt occupied. Slowly, painfully, awareness began to trickle back. The smell of the cellar returned, dust and damp. But now it was mingled with the heavy, musky scent of their sweat and the ozone tang of spent magic. Draco shifted. He didn't pull away. He couldn't seem to summon the strength, but he pushed himself up slightly, relieving her of his full weight. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. He let his forehead rest against the stone floor beside her head, his eyes squeezed shut. "Are you?" His voice was a wreck. He cleared his throat, trying to find the words. "Are you intact?" Hermione blinked, tears she hadn't realized she was crying sliding hot into her hairline. "I think so," she whispered. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. "It stopped." "The cycle completed," Draco said, the words heavy with a knowledge he didn't want to possess. He rolled off her, moving slowly, like an old man. He didn't go far. He collapsed onto his back just inches away, staring up at the darkness. They lay there in the silence, side by side, destroyed and remade. The distance between them was negligible, yet it felt like a canyon. The intimacy of the last few hours hung in the air, a physical presence. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had shared a space more private than a bedroom, more sacred than a church. They had shared the very essence of their lives to keep the darkness at bay. Hermione turned her head slightly. She looked at his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the curve of his nose, the way his eyelashes cast long shadows on his cheekbones. He looked younger now, stripped of his defenses. He looked like the boy he might have been if the world hadn't twisted him. She reached out. It was an involuntary movement, a phantom limb syndrome of the soul. Her fingers brushed the back of his hand where it lay on the stone. Draco flinched. He didn't pull away, but the muscle in his jaw jumped. He opened his eyes and turned his head to look at her. The darkness was back in his gaze, but it was brittle now. The walls were up, but they were made of glass. "Don't," he whispered. It wasn't a command, it was a plea. "Don't make this human." "It was human, Draco," she said softly. "It was the most human thing you've ever done." He squeezed his eyes shut again, a look of profound pain crossing his face. "That wasn't me, Granger. That was the ritual. That was survival." "Was it?" He didn't answer. He couldn't, because they both knew that the magic had only provided the conduit. The desperation, the clinging, the way his hand had cradled the back of her head when the pain was at its worst. That had been him. And the way she had arched into him, seeking his solidity, seeking his heat, that had been her. Hermione pulled her hand back, curling it against her chest. The warmth in her belly pulsed again, a soft, secret rhythm. A second heartbeat? No, just the echo of the magic, just the residue. She closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her down like a heavy tide. "Sleep," Draco murmured, his voice sounding far away. "The circle is down. We can leave at dawn." "Draco." "Yeah, we're alive." There was a long pause. The silence of the manor settled around them, no longer predatory, just empty. "I know," he said, and he sounded like he wished they weren't. Hermione let the darkness take her, but even as she drifted into sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling of the seal snapping shut inside her. The feeling that something had begun in this room, something that wouldn't end when the sun rose. The covenant had been made, and the silence was its witness. The dawn did not break. It bruised the sky. Grey light filtered through the high, grime-streaked windows of the cellar, bleeding into the darkness like diluted ink. It was a cold, unforgiving illumination that stripped away the shadows, leaving nowhere to hide. Hermione woke to the sensation of stone against her cheek and a rhythmic, slow movement beneath her ear. For a fractured second, suspended between sleep and wakefulness, she felt safe. She felt anchored. The heat that had consumed her during the night had settled into a steady, comforting hum, a low-voltage current running from the body beneath hers straight into her own marrow. Then memory returned, not as a flood, but as a sharp, surgical incision. She stiffened. Beneath her, Draco Malfoy was already awake. She could tell by the rigidity of his chest, the way his breathing was too controlled, too quiet. He was a statue carved from tension. One of his arms was still wrapped around her waist, his hands splayed flat against the small of her back, holding her as if the floor might open up and swallow them both. The intimacy of it was horrifying in the morning light. In the dark, it had been survival. In the grey dawn, it looked like something else. It looked like choice. Hermione scrambled back, the movement abrupt and clumsy. Her limbs felt heavy, disjointed, as if they didn't quite belong to her anymore. She gasped as the cold air hit the space where his body had been, a physical shock that made her shiver violently. Draco didn't try to stop her. He let his arm fall to the stone floor with a dull thud. He sat up slowly, turning his back to her, his spine a knotted line of vertebrae pressing against his pale skin. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture erratic, shaking. "The circle," he rasped. His voice was ruined, cracked and dry. "It's down." Hermione looked at the floor. The glowing red runes were gone. The obsidian flagstones were dark and lifeless again, indistinguishable from any other damp cellar floor. The magical cage that had forced them to meld their souls together had evaporated, leaving only the wreckage in its wake. "Right," Hermione whispered. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to cover the thin camisole, trying to cover the skin he had spent hours pressing against. "Right." She scrambled for her discarded clothes. Her cardigan was a crumpled heap near the wall. Her outer robe was gone. Ash, she remembered, burned by the initial flare. She pulled the cardigan on with trembling fingers, buttoning it all the way to her chin, a futile attempt to armor herself. The silence in the room was louder than the magic had been. It was a thick, suffocating thing, filled with the echoes of their gasps, their heartbeats, the unspoken terror they had shared. Draco stood up. He swayed slightly, catching himself against the iron shelving. He looked ill. His skin was the color of parchment. Dark circles bruised beneath his eyes, and the hollows of his cheeks seemed deeper than the day before. He pulled his shirt on, his movements jerky, aggressive. He buttoned it wrong, missed a loop, cursed under his breath, and tore it open to start again. He couldn't look at her. "Malfoy," Hermione started, her voice shaking. She didn't know what she wanted to say. "Thank you. I'm sorry. Are you okay?" None of the words fit the shape of the reality they were in. "Don't!" He cut her off, sharp and cold. He finally managed to fasten the shirt. He grabbed his jacket from the floor, shaking the dust off it with a violent snap. "We leave. Now!" He walked past her without glancing in her direction. The air stirred as he passed, carrying that scent, ozone, fear, and him, that was now stamped into her olfactory memory. Hermione followed him. She felt small, hollowed out. The walk up the cellar stairs felt like an ascent from the underworld. Her legs were weak, her magical core feeling strangely drained yet sensitive, vibrating at a frequency she didn't recognize. When they emerged into the main hall of the manor, the contrast was jarring. The house was exactly as they had left it, cold, imposing, silent. The portraits slept. The dust motes danced in the pale morning light. It was as if the night in the cellar had happened in a pocket dimension, a fever dream that the rest of the world hadn't witnessed. Draco stopped at the main entrance. He opened the heavy door, letting in a gust of wet autumnal wind. The rain had stopped, leaving the grounds shrouded in mist. He stood there, holding the door, staring out at the gravel drive. He looked like a man waiting for a firing squad. "The Ministry report," Hermione said, her voice sounding strangely professional, a desperate attempt to cling to the familiar. "I have to file it. I have to explain why the sensors triggered." Draco's jaw tightened. "Tell them it was a residual echo," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Tell them the foundations are settling. Tell them whatever you want, Granger. Just don't tell them the truth." "Draco, we can't just—" He turned on her then, and the look in his eyes stopped her dead. It wasn't anger. It was self-loathing so profound it was painful to witness. "What do you want to discuss?" he hissed, stepping closer, though he was careful not to touch her. "Do you want to analyze the arithmancy of how our magical cores fused? Do you want to write a paper on the sensation of my pulse in your veins? Because I don't. I want to forget I ever dragged you into this cursed house." "You didn't drag me," Hermione argued, her chin lifting reflexively. "I came here. It was my job." "And look what it cost you," he said softly, his gaze dropping to her hands, which were still trembling. "Go home, Hermione. Wash the smell of this place off you. Pretend it never happened." He used her first name. It sounded like an apology and a goodbye all at once. "And you?" she asked. "I stay here," he said, looking back at the dark, empty hall behind him. "I stay with the ghosts." He stepped back and began to close the door. "Wait," she said, but the heavy wood was already moving. "Goodbye, Granger." The door clicked shut. The sound was final. A lock engaging. A book closing. Hermione stood on the step for a long time, the mist curling around her ankles, staring at the dark wood. She felt a phantom pressure against her side, a ghost of his warmth that the cold wind couldn't chase away. The weeks that followed were a blur of grey static. Hermione returned to her flat, to her life, to the tidy, organized existence she had built post-war. She stood under the shower for 45 minutes that first morning, scrubbing her skin until it was raw and pink, using a harsh, muggle soap that smelled of lemons. She wanted to scrub away the sensation of the stone floor, the smell of old magic, the feel of his breath on her neck. But she couldn't scrub away the feeling inside. She went to work. She filed the report. False alarm. Residual dark energy discharge due to structural instability. Site secured. She lied to Harry over lunch. She told him she was just tired, just a bug, just the weather. When he asked why she flinched when Ron clapped a hand on her shoulder, she knocked over her tea to create a distraction. She couldn't bear to be touched. Every touch felt shallow, superficial compared to the bone-deep connection she had experienced in the circle. It was as if the volume of the world had been turned down. Conversations felt trivial. The paperwork on her desk felt meaningless. She felt like she was walking around in a glass jar, separated from everyone else by an invisible wall of secrets. And then, there was the magic. It started subtly. A quill would snap in her hand when she was only holding it lightly. A candle would flare up when she walked into a room. Her magic felt restless, expanded, too big for her body. It surged and ebbed with a tide she couldn't predict. She found herself waking up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, her hand clutching her stomach. Not because she was in pain, but because she felt hollow. She felt an ache of separation that had no physical source. She dreamt of him, not romantic dreams, not soft, hazy fantasies. She dreamt of the dark, of the heat, of the way he had looked at her when the light took them, like she was the only thing keeping him from disintegrating. She woke up sweating, her heart racing, the smell of ozone lingering in her bedroom like a haunting. She didn't contact him. She couldn't. What would she say? "Dear Draco, I can't sleep because my magic is looking for yours." Draco was silent. The manor was silent. He had retreated into the exile he had carved for himself. He didn't come to the ministry. He didn't answer owls. He became a rumor again, a ghost story told in the corridors of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Have you heard? The Malfoy heir has gone mad. Locked himself up in that house. Says the walls are talking to him. Hermione heard the whispers and felt a spike of guilt so sharp it pierced her chest. She knew he wasn't mad. She knew he was grieving. He was grieving the loss of his isolation, the breach of his defenses. He was punishing himself for the crime of surviving and for the greater crime of needing her to do it. 3 weeks after the incident, the physical symptoms began to shift. The restlessness turned into fatigue, a heavy, leaden exhaustion that dragged at her eyelids at 2 in the afternoon. Then came the nausea. It wasn't the sharp sickness of a virus. It was a low, rolling wave that hit her every morning when she smelled coffee. She ignored it. It was stress. It was the trauma. It was the after effects of exposure to dark artifacts. She buried herself in research, pulling dusty tomes on blood curses and ancient rituals from the restricted section, reading them late into the night. She told herself she was looking for a way to help him, a way to cleanse the manor. She was lying to herself. She was looking for an explanation for the changes in her own body. She found the passage on a rainy Tuesday, sitting on her living room floor, surrounded by piles of parchment. The book was Archaic Bindings and the Preservation of Lineage, a text so old the pages felt like cloth. The sanguis vinculum is not merely a defensive ward, the text read, the ink fading but legible. It is an imperative. When the line is threatened with extinction, the magic does not seek to protect the existing vessel. It seeks to create a new one. It demands a union of incompatible forces to forge a stronger heir. The circle does not break until the covenant is sealed in flesh. Hermione stopped reading. The room went very quiet, sealed in flesh. Her hand went to her stomach. It was an automatic movement, unconscious. She thought about the heat, the way the magic had flowed into her, not just through her. The sensation of being filled, of being claimed, the lock snapping into place. No, she whispered to the empty room. No, that's impossible. They hadn't had sex, not in the traditional sense. There had been no undressing beyond the necessary, no act of intercourse. Just the pressing of bodies, the sharing of magic, the sweat and the fear. But this was magic. Ancient, primordial magic that predated biology. didn't need sperm and egg. It needed life force and intent. It needed a mother and a father, and a desperate need to survive. She stood up, the book sliding from her lap to the floor with a heavy thud. She felt dizzy, the world tilted on its axis. She needed to know. She needed to be sure. With shaking hands, she raised her wand. She didn't use a standard Mediwitch spell. Those looked for biological markers. She used an old charm she had found in the margins of the book, a spell designed to detect magical signatures within a host. Revelio Sanguinis. The tip of her wand glowed. Not white, not gold. It glowed a soft, pulsing silver, the color of the Malfoy crest, the color of Draco's eyes. A second light appeared, intertwined with the silver, a rich, deep gold, her own signature. The two lights danced together in the air before her, twisting, merging, forming a double helix of pure light. Hermione dropped her wand. It clattered on the floorboards. She backed away until her legs hit the sofa, and she collapsed onto it. She stared at the space where the light had been. She wasn't just pregnant. She was carrying a construct of pure magic, a child woven from the survival instincts of two enemies who had been forced to become one. The silence of the last 3 weeks suddenly shattered. The distance between her and the manor collapsed. She wasn't alone in her flat. She would never be alone again. And in the silence of the room, Hermione Granger realized that the circle hadn't broken at all. It had simply moved inside her. The iron gates of Malfoy Manor did not screech when she approached them. They did not shudder or resist. Instead, as Hermione stepped out of the crack of apparition, the heavy metal swung open with a silent, terrifying smoothness. It was a welcome, and that was far worse than a threat. Hermione stood on the precipice of the drive, the gravel wet and shining like crushed bone under the winter moon. The air here was thinner, sharper. It tasted of pine needles and decay. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, her hand pressing reflexively against her stomach, a gesture she had developed in the last 48 hours and already hated. She hadn't sent an owl. She hadn't flewed. The connection between them, the silver thread of the vinculum that she now saw in her mind's eye every time she blinked, told her he was there. It told her he was awake. It told her he was drowning. She walked up the drive. The wards, usually a prickly mesh of defensive spells that scanned and judged every visitor, felt different. As she passed through the perimeter, she felt a sensation like warm oil sliding over her skin. The magic of the estate wasn't checking her ID. It was recognizing its own signature inside her. It was caressing her. A shudder racked her frame, violent and nauseating. "You belong to us now," the stones seemed to whisper. The front door was unlocked. Hermione stepped into the entrance hall. It was dark, save for a single candelabra floating near the grand staircase, its wax dripping onto the marble. The house felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum where someone was still breathing. "I told you to stay away." The voice came from the shadows of the drawing room archway. It was rough, steeped in the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. Draco stepped into the light. He looked worse than he had 3 weeks ago. He was wearing the same black trousers, but his shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark mark, which looked stark against his pale skin. He held a tumbler of amber liquid in one hand, his grip loose, dangerous. "I couldn't," Hermione said. Her voice was steady, but her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Couldn't? He laughed, a low, humorless sound that scraped against the walls. Did the savior complex finally eat the rest of your brain, Granger? Or did you just miss the thrill of nearly dying? He took a drink, his eyes never leaving her face. They were bloodshot, rimmed with red, but the grey irises were sharp, burning with a feverish intensity. He was angry. He was terrified. He was trying to drive her out with teeth and claws because he didn't know how else to handle her presence. "It's not a complex," she said, taking a step toward him. He took a step back. The rejection was visceral. "Don't come closer," he warned, raising the glass as if it were a shield. "I mean it. You filed the report. You did your job. The circle is closed. We survived. End of story." "The circle isn't closed, Draco." The use of his given name made him flinch. He set the glass down on a side table with a clatter that echoed too loudly in the empty room. He ran a hand over his face, pressing his fingers into his eyes, as if trying to push the headache back into his skull. "I can feel you," he whispered, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a raw, bleeding honesty. "Do you know that? For 3 weeks, I can feel when you wake up. I can feel when you're anxious. I can feel." He gestured vaguely at the air between them. "I thought it would fade. I thought it was just the aftershocks. But it's getting stronger." "I know. Why is it getting stronger?" He dropped his hand and looked at her. "Granger, what did we do?" Hermione didn't answer immediately. She walked past him into the drawing room, the room where Bellatrix had carved the word into her arm, the room that smelled of old cruelty. She needed to be sitting down for this. She needed him to be sitting down. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the velvet armchair near the cold fireplace. "I don't want to sit. I want you to leave before I burn this house down with both of us inside it." "You won't burn it down," she said softly, turning to face him. "Because the magic won't let you. It won't let you destroy the sanctuary now. Not anymore." Draco went still. He was a creature of instinct, and his instincts had just picked up the scent of a trap. He looked at her, really looked at her, scanning her face, her posture, the way her hand hovered protectively over her midsection. His eyes narrowed. He looked at her hand, then back to her face. The color drained from his lips. "No," he breathed. It wasn't a question. It was a denial of reality. "The ritual," Hermione began, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain clinical. "It wasn't a stasis field. It wasn't a defense mechanism. It was a creation rite. Sanguis vinculum aeternum. It activates when the line is threatened with extinction." Draco was shaking his head, a slow, repetitive motion. He backed away until his legs hit the edge of the sofa, and he sank onto it, not because he chose to, but because his knees gave out. "We didn't..." He swallowed hard. "We didn't do anything. We just existed. We just survived the heat." "The magic didn't need the act," Hermione said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "It needed the intent. It needed the life force. It fused our cause, Draco. It took the survival instinct, your desperation to live, my desperation to save you, and it made something out of it." She unbuttoned her coat and let it fall open. She wasn't showing, not physically. She was still slender, still herself. But to a wizard, to the other half of the bond, the truth was blinding. "Look," she whispered. Draco stared at her stomach. For a moment, Nothing happened. Then the magic in the room surged. The air grew heavy and sweet. A soft silver light began to pulse from beneath her shirt, answering the proximity of its father. It was a faint, rhythmic glow. Thump, thump, thump. It beat in time with the blood in Draco's veins. Draco made a sound that was half sob, half retch. He covered his mouth with his hand, his eyes wide with horror. This wasn't joy. This wasn't a miracle. This was a curse made flesh. I wanted it to end, he choked out, his voice muffled behind his hand. The name, the blood. I wanted it to die with me. I made sure. I never touched anyone. I never let anyone close. He looked up at her, his eyes wet. I tried to kill the legacy, Granger. And you saved it? I didn't ask for this, Hermione snapped, the anger finally cracking through her composure. Tears, hot and sharp, pricked her eyes. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I woke up wishing to carry the child of a man who watched me be tortured in this very room? I am a victim here too, Malfoy. My body was hijacked by your ancestors' arrogance. The outburst hung in the air, vibrating with the force of her pain. Draco flinched as if she had struck him. He looked at the spot on the floor where she had been bled years ago, then back at her. The guilt on his face was a physical deformity, twisting his features. Get it out, he whispered. Hermione froze. What? Terminate it, he said, his voice rising, bordering on hysterical. He stood up, his movements erratic. We can fix this. St. Mungo's or a potion. I'll pay for it. I'll pay for anything. Just get that thing out of you. It's not a child, Hermione. It's a parasite. It's a contract written in blood. I can't, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Why? You're the smartest witch of the age. You can figure it out. Unravel the spell. Reverse the process. I tried, she screamed back. Don't you think I tried? I spent 3 days in the restricted section. I ran every simulation. I cast every diagnostic. She took a breath, a ragged gasp that hurt her lungs. It's not just inside me, Draco. It is woven into my magical core. If I try to remove it, if I try to terminate the pregnancy, she looked him dead in the eye. It will kill me. The bond is absolute. Life for life. If the child dies, the vessel dies. Draco stopped moving. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the opulence of his hated heritage, and he looked completely destroyed. So, he whispered, I've killed you after all. The silence that followed was heavy, crushing. It was the silence of a tomb sealing shut. Draco walked towards her. He moved slowly, like a man walking to the gallows. He stopped inches from her. He smelled of fire whiskey and rain. He didn't touch her. He just stared at her midsection, at the invisible life that was holding a wand to her throat. It's a boy, she said softly. The knowledge had come to her in a dream, or perhaps the magic had simply whispered it. Draco closed his eyes. A tear leaked out, tracking a path through the grime on his cheek. A Malfoy, he murmured with disgust. Another Malfoy. And a Granger, she corrected him. Half-blood. That has to count for something. He opened his eyes. There was no comfort in them, only a bleak, endless winter. It counts for danger. The magic won't like that. The manor won't like that. The manor seems to like it just fine, she said bitterly, glancing around at the walls. It opened the doors for me. It opened the doors for the heir, Draco corrected. You are just the container. The cruelty of the words stung, but Hermione saw the self-hatred behind them. He wasn't insulting her. He was stating the brutal logic of his family's magic. To the house, she was disposable. Essential, but disposable. "I need to stay," she said. The words hung there, absurd and necessary. Draco looked at her, startled. "What?" "The pregnancy. It's draining me. My magic is fluctuating. Being away from the source, from you, from the anchor of the ritual, it makes it worse. I almost collapsed yesterday." She wrapped her arms around herself again. "I can't survive this alone, Draco. Physically, I mean. The magic needs proximity to stabilize." He stared at her, his expression shifting from horror to a sort of numb resignation. He was trapped. He had built a fortress of solitude to protect the world from his darkness, and now the person he had hurt most was forcing her way in, carrying the very thing he feared most. "You want to live here," he said flatly. "With me." "I don't want to," Hermione replied, her voice firm. "I have to, until the child is born. After that, we figure it out." "Figure it out?" he echoed. He laughed again, that broken, wheezing sound. "There is no figuring it out, Granger. We are bound. Sanguis vinculum aeternum. Eternity. Do you understand what that word means?" He reached out then. His hand hovered over her stomach. He was trembling. He looked like he was about to touch a hot stove. Slowly, agonizingly, he pressed his palm against the fabric of her coat. The reaction was instantaneous. A wave of visible golden light rippled out from Hermione, washing over the room. The candles flared, the flames turning blue. The cold dampness of the room vanished, replaced by a suffocating dry heat. Hermione gasped, her knees buckling as a rush of pure energy, Draco's energy, flooded into her, filling the hollow spaces the baby had carved out. It felt like a drug. It felt like coming home. Draco hissed, his head falling forward until his forehead rested against hers. He didn't pull his hand away. He couldn't. The magic had latched onto him, feeding, drinking, satisfied. "I hate this," he whispered against her skin. "I hate this so much." "I know," she whispered back, closing her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You can take the east wing," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. "It's the warmest. Stay out of my sight." "Draco!" "Don't!" He cut her off, pulling his hand away with a violent jerk, severing the connection. The loss of warmth made Hermione gasp. He stepped back, his face a mask of stone. "Don't try to make this a redemption arc, Granger. This isn't a love story. It's a tragedy." He turned and walked out of the room, taking the bottle of whiskey with him, leaving her alone in the dark with the ghosts of his ancestors and the heartbeat of his son. But as he ascended the stairs, Hermione felt it, the faint, treacherous thread of relief in his mind. He wasn't alone anymore, and God help him, he was glad. The winter at Malfoy Manor was not a season, it was a sentence. Snow did not fall softly here. It accumulated in heavy, suffocating drifts that muffled the world, turning the grounds into a white void. The silence was absolute, broken only by the settling of the ancient timber and the restless, pacing footsteps of the man in the West Wing. Hermione had been living in the East Wing for 2 months. She had learned the rhythm of the house, the way the shadows lengthened in the afternoon, the way the portraits watched her with a mixture of suspicion and reverence. She had learned that the manor was not merely a building, but a servant to the bloodline. It catered to her needs with a terrifying, obsequious efficiency. If she shivered, the fire flared. If she stumbled, a rug would seemingly smooth itself to catch her. It was possessive. It was protecting the vessel. But the one thing the house could not give her was the one thing she was starving for. Draco kept his word. He stayed out of her sight. He was a ghost in his own home, a flicker of black robes at the end of a corridor, a shadow passing a doorway. They lived a strange, choreographed dance of avoidance. She would enter the library, he would exit the drawing room. She would come down for breakfast to find a plate of food kept under a stasis charm, the chair opposite her empty and cold. Yet she was never truly alone. The bond, the sanguis vinculum, was a live wire buried in her chest. She felt him constantly. She felt his insomnia, a jagged electric static that kept her awake until dawn. She felt his darker moods, heavy and suffocating like smoke in her lungs. And most dangerously, she felt his hunger, not for food, for the connection. The pregnancy was advancing with unnatural speed. The magic that had created the child was accelerating its growth, demanding more resources than a human body could provide. Hermione was waning. Her skin had taken on a translucent porcelain quality. Her cheekbones were too sharp. Her own magical core, once a roaring fire, was now a flickering candle, drained daily by the voracious entity growing inside her. She needed a recharge. She needed him. But Draco was starving himself, and by extension, he was starving her. He was fighting the pull with a stubbornness that bordered on suicidal. It came to a head on a Tuesday evening in late January. Hermione was in the library, the vast circular room lit only by the floating candelabras. She was searching for a countercharm for the nausea that had plagued her for days, her fingers tracing the spines of books she didn't have the strength to pull down. She reached for a heavy tome on the third shelf, Magical Maladies of the Blood. Her arm trembled. As she grasped the leather spine, a wave of dizziness hit her. It wasn't a simple lightheadedness. It was a total system failure. The floor tilted violently. The grey edges of her vision rushed inward. The baby moved. It wasn't a flutter, it was a demand. A sharp, powerful twist that siphoned the last dregs of her energy. Hermione gasped, the sound small and wet in the silence. Her knees buckled. She didn't feel the impact of the floor. She only felt the cold seeping into her bones and the terrified, erratic stutter of her own heart. Draco. She didn't scream it. She didn't even speak it. She projected it. A frantic, primal distress signal sent down the silver wire connecting them. The response was instantaneous. The library doors banged open, hitting the stone walls with a crack like thunder. Draco didn't run. He blurred. One moment the doorway was empty. The next, he was sliding to his knees beside her, his face a mask of panicked fury. "Stupid!" he hissed, his hands hovering over her, but not landing, terrified to touch, terrified not to. "Stupid, stubborn witch! Why didn't you call the elf?" "Couldn't," Hermione whispered. Her lips were blue. He took it all. Draco's gaze dropped to her stomach, swollen beneath her heavy wool jumper. A look of profound hatred crossed his face, not at her, but at the life inside her. "Parasite!" he spat. He grabbed her. There was no gentleness in it, only desperation. He hauled her upright, pulling her back against his chest, wrapping his arms around her to maximize the contact. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breathing ragged and harsh. The transfer was violent. It wasn't the slow, warm trickle of the early days. It was a dam breaking. Hermione arched her back, a gasp tearing from her throat as Draco's magic flooded into her. It was dark, cold, and immensely powerful. It tasted of storm clouds and iron. It rushed into her depleted core, filling the void, shocking her heart back into a steady rhythm. "Breathe," Draco commanded, his voice vibrating against her spine. "Take it. Take it all." He was feeding her his life force. Hermione clung to his forearms, her fingers digging into the fabric of his sleeves. The relief was so intense it bordered on pain. The grey fog lifted from her vision. The cold receded, replaced by the furnace heat of his body pressing against hers. They stayed like that for a long time, huddled on the library floor, a tangle of limbs and heavy breathing. The silence returned, but it was charged now, heavy with the scent of ozone and cedar. Slowly, the frantic edge of the transfer leveled out into a steady, thrumming hum. Draco didn't let go. He kept his arms locked around her, his chin resting on her shoulder, his nose buried in her hair. He was shaking. "You let it get too low," he murmured, his voice wrecked. "You almost flickered out." "You were blocking me," Hermione accused weakly, leaning back against him because she didn't have the strength to hold herself up. "You were shielding your signature. I couldn't reach you. Because I can't stand it." The confession burst out of him, raw and ugly. He tightened his grip, almost painful. "I can't stand feeling you constantly. I can't stand knowing that my magic, my cursed, blood-stained magic, is the only thing keeping you alive. Every time I give it to you, I feel like I'm poisoning you." "It's not poison, Draco. It's sustenance." "It's a chain," he corrected. He shifted, one of his hands moving from her arm to rest flat against her stomach. It was the first time he had touched the pregnancy voluntarily since the night she returned. Beneath his palm, the baby kicked. Draco froze. His entire body went rigid against her back. The kick happened again, strong, deliberate, responding to the influx of magic, responding to him. "He knows you," Hermione whispered. Draco made a sound in his throat, a low growl of denial. He tried to pull his hand away, but he didn't complete the motion. His fingers curled slightly, gripping the wool of her jumper. "He doesn't know me," Draco said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He knows the signature. He recognizes the fuel source. That's all. He is your son." "He is a requirement," Draco snapped. "He is a clause in a contract written by a madman 3 centuries ago." "Does he feel like a clause?" Hermione asked softly. She placed her hand over Draco's, pressing it down. "Does he feel like ink and parchment?" Under their combined hands, the child rolled, a slow, undulating movement that was undeniable. Life. Fierce, demanding life. Draco's breath hitched. He rested his forehead against the side of her head, closing his eyes. For a moment, the mask slipped entirely. Hermione felt a wave of crushing sadness wash over her through the bond, a grief so deep it felt like drowning. He wasn't rejecting the child because he hated it. He was rejecting the child because he was terrified he would destroy it. "I will ruin him," Draco whispered, the admission barely audible. "I am rot, Granger. Everything I touch decays. Look at this house. Look at my parents. Look at you." "I am not decaying," Hermione said firmly. "I am growing, and so is he." "You are fading," he argued, his voice cracking. "You are half the person you were 3 months ago. He is eating you alive." "Then feed us," she challenged him. She turned in his arms, shifting so she could look at him. His face was pale, the scars of his stress etched deep around his mouth. He looked at her with a mix of hunger and resentment. "I am," he said. "Gods help me, I am." He didn't pull away. Instead, he shifted his weight, pulling her up until she was seated on his lap, her legs draped over his. It was an intimate position, necessitated by the need for grounding, but it felt like a surrender. He rested his hand on her stomach again, this time with intention. He closed his eyes and pushed. The magic flowed smoother this time. Not a flood, but a river. Hermione sighed, her head falling back against his shoulder. She felt the child settle, soothed by the presence of its father's magic. "The name," Draco said suddenly, his eyes still closed. Hermione blinked, looking at his profile. "What?" "If he survives. If you survive. He cannot be a Draco. He cannot be a Lucius. Those names are dead." "I was thinking..." Hermione hesitated. "Scorpius." Draco's eyes opened. He looked at her, startled. "Scorpius? It's a constellation," she said. "Like yours. But it's different. Scorpius is intense, passionate, a warrior, but not a dragon." "A scorpion," Draco mused, the corner of his mouth twitching in a micro-expression that might have been a smile in another life. "Small, venomous, hard to kill." "Exactly. It's a Malfoy name," he said quietly. "My grandfather considered it." "It fits," Hermione said. "He's a fighter. He survived the ritual. He's surviving this." Draco looked down at where his hand rested on her belly. His expression softened, just a fraction. The ice in his eyes thawed into something resembling water. "Scorpius," he tested the word. The baby didn't kick. He just pushed back, a steady pressure against Draco's palm, an acknowledgement. "Fine," Draco murmured. "Scorpius." He looked back at Hermione. The intensity of his gaze was unsettling. The repulsion phase of their cycle had broken, giving way to a terrifying, high-stakes approach. "You stay in the West Wing tonight," he said. It wasn't a request. "Draco, The energy transfer dissipates too quickly across the house," he interrupted, his voice clinical again, rebuilding the walls. "If you stay in my quarters, the ambient magic will sustain you while you sleep. I won't have you collapsing on the floor again. It's inefficient." "Inefficient," Hermione repeated, almost smiling. "Yes, inefficient." He stood up, lifting her effortlessly into his arms, as if she weighed nothing. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "You can barely stand," he corrected. He carried her out of the library, through the dark corridors of the manor. He didn't look at the portraits. He didn't look at the shadows. He looked straight ahead, his jaw set, carrying his enemy, his burden, his legacy. When they reached the West Wing, he kicked the door open. The room was vast, dominated by a massive four-poster bed draped in emerald and silver. A fire roared in the grate. It was warm. It smelled of him. He deposited her on the bed, pulling the heavy duvet over her. "Sleep," he commanded. "Where will you sleep?" she asked, looking at the expanse of the mattress. Draco walked to the armchair by the fire. He sat down, stretching his long legs out, looking exhausted and weary. "I don't sleep," he said. "I watch." "Draco, go to sleep, Granger, before I change my mind and throw you out into the snow." It was a lie. They both knew it. He couldn't throw her out if he wanted to. The bond wouldn't let him. Hermione curled onto her side, facing him. The scent of him was everywhere, lulling her. Her magic felt full, stable, quiet. "Good night, Draco," she whispered. He didn't answer. He just watched the flames, a sentinel in the dark. But as Hermione drifted off, pulled under by the heavy tide of sleep, she felt a brush of thought against her mind. Not a spoken word, but a feeling projected through the silver wire. Stay. It was the first time he had asked. March came to Wiltshire, not with a gentle thaw, but with a violent, cracking fracture of the winter ice. The wind howled around the turrets of Malfoy Manor, rattling the leaded panes of the west wing, sounding less like weather and more like a warning. Inside the sanctuary of Draco's quarters, the atmosphere had shifted into a strange, suspended reality. The boundaries of their existence had shrunk to the four walls of the bedroom, the firelight, and the terrifyingly domestic routine of two enemies waiting for a life to begin. Hermione sat in the velvet armchair by the fire, her body heavy and unfamiliar to her. She was vast now, the child, Scorpius, taking up every inch of space, pressing against her ribs, her spine, her lungs. She rested a hand on the curve of her belly, feeling the restless churn of movement beneath the skin. He was agitated tonight. He felt the storm outside. Across the room, Draco stood by the window, staring out into the black rain. He was dressed in only his trousers and a white shirt, the sleeves rolled up. He had stopped wearing the heavy black robes in the West Wing. The armor had been stripped away by necessity. He hadn't looked at her in an hour, but the bond between them was singing a high, tense note. It was a silver wire pulled taut, transmitting his anxiety directly into her bloodstream. "Stop thinking so loud," Hermione murmured, shifting her weight. A wince of discomfort flickered across her face. Draco turned. His movement was sharp, fluid. "I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. You're projecting enough panic to fill the room." He walked over to the fireplace, leaning an arm against the mantel, looking down at the flames. The firelight cast deep shadows in the hollows of his eyes. He looked exhausted, haunted, beautiful in a wrecked sort of way. "The contracts are ready," he said abruptly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Hermione went still. "Contracts? For after," Draco said, his voice devoid of inflection. He picked up a poker and stabbed at a log, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "Custody, visitation, financial support. I've drawn up the papers. The manor won't let you stay. Once the heir is born, the crisis condition ends. The vinculum will dissolve. The doors will lock you out again." Hermione felt a cold knot tighten in her chest. For months they had lived in this bubble, sustained by the magic and the shared beating of their hearts. She had allowed herself to forget that it was temporary, that she was a vessel and he was the reluctant guardian. "You're evicting me," she stated, her voice trembling slightly, "before he's even born." "I am ensuring your safety," Draco corrected, looking at her then. His eyes were cold, grey flint. "You cannot raise him here, Hermione. This house is a tomb. It's full of dark magic and ghosts who will whisper poison in his ear. You take him. You leave. I will provide from a distance." "From a distance?" Hermione pushed herself up, struggling against the weight of the pregnancy. Anger flared, hot and sudden. "You think you can just hand him over like a parcel and walk away? After everything? After this?" She gestured between them to the invisible current of energy that connected them even now. "This," Draco sneered, gesturing vaguely at the air, "is a survival mechanism. Do not mistake adrenaline for affection, Granger. Do not mistake proximity for intimacy. Once the magic fades, we go back to being who we are. I am a Malfoy. You are the Golden Girl. We do not mix. You're a coward, she whispered. Draco flinched. The mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of raw, terrified vulnerability. Yes, he hissed. I am. I am terrified of what I might do to him. To you. I am poison, Hermione. Haven't you learned that yet? I learned that you kept me alive, she argued, stepping closer to him, ignoring the ache in her back. I learned that your magic saved us. I learned that you are not your father. Don't, he warned, backing away. Don't try to save me. I'm not trying to save you. I'm trying to... She gasped. The sentence was cut off by a sensation that felt like a hook catching behind her navel and pulling down. It wasn't pain. Not yet. It was a rupture. A sound like a cracking whip echoed through the room. Hermione looked down. A pool of clear fluid was spreading rapidly across the dark Persian rug, soaking into the wool. But it wasn't just water. It was glowing. Faint wisps of silver steam were rising from the floor. A seal, she whispered, clutching her stomach. Draco froze. He stared at the floor, then at her face. The color drained from his skin, leaving him grey. Now, he choked out. It's too early. It's 3 weeks early. The magic. Hermione grabbed the back of the armchair as a contraction hit her. It wasn't a wave. It was a wall. She cried out, her knees buckling. It's claiming the debt. Draco moved. The paralysis broke. He was at her side instantly, catching her before she hit the floor. He scooped her up, his arms strong and shaking, and carried her to the massive bed. Not yet, he muttered, sounding like he was bargaining with a deity he didn't believe in. Not yet, you little bastard. She's not ready. He laid her down. Hermione gripped the sheets, her knuckles white. The pain was escalating with terrifying speed. This wasn't natural labor. This was the sanguis vinculum uncoiling, ripping its way out of her core. Draco, she sobbed, her head trashing on the pillow. It burns! It burns! I know, he said, his voice tight with panic. He was hovering over her, his wand out, casting diagnostic spells that lit up the air with frantic red pulses. The magical output is spiking. He's trying to brute force his way out. Help me. I'm here, he said, dropping the wand. Magic wouldn't help now. He grabbed her hand. I'm here. The room began to shake. The portraits on the walls woke up, the painted figures fleeing their frames. The candles flared into towering pillars of flame, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like demons on the walls. Hermione screamed. It was a sound torn from the bottom of her soul. The contraction was a physical vice, squeezing her internal organs, crushing the breath from her lungs. She felt the baby moving down, not with the slow progression of nature, but with the impatient violence of magic. Breathe, Draco yelled, leaning over her, his face inches from hers. Granger, look at me. Breathe. I can't. You have to. You did not survive the war. You did not survive the circle just to die in my bed. He placed his other hand on her stomach. The contact sent a jolt through them both. Hermione arched off the mattress, a guttural cry tearing from her throat. Draco groaned, his head falling forward. He was absorbing the pain. He was siphoning the excess magic that was threatening to tear her apart. Take it, she gasped, gripping his forearm until she drew blood with her nails. Take it! I've got you, he gritted out, sweat dripping from his forehead onto her cheek. "I've got you." Time dissolved into a kaleidoscope of agony and light. There were no minutes, only the rhythm of the contractions and the terrifying ancient power filling the room. The manor was singing. The stones were humming a low bass note of anticipation. The air was coming. Draco was a constant presence in the storm. He wiped her face with a cool cloth. He held her when she shook. He whispered things in her ear. Nonsense, prayers, curses, anything to keep her tethered to the world. "He's almost here," Draco said, his voice sounding wet. He was at the foot of the bed now. The air smelled of ozone, copper, and the sea. "Hermione, one more. You have to give me one more." "I have nothing left," she whimpered, her head lolling to the side. Her hair was plastered to her skull. She felt hollowed out, consumed. "I'm empty." "No, you're not," Draco said fiercely. He crawled up the bed, grabbing her face in both hands, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were wild, stripped of all defenses. "You are the strongest witch of the age. You are Hermione Granger. You do not quit. Do you hear me? You do not quit." He kissed her forehead. It was hard, desperate. "Push!" he commanded. Hermione screamed, summoning the last dregs of her strength, the last sparks of her magic. She pushed against the pain, against the fear, against the crushing weight of the destiny she hadn't chosen. She felt a tearing sensation, a massive shift in pressure, and then silence. The room went instantly, deafeningly quiet. The shaking stopped. The candles dimmed to a normal flicker. The wind outside ceased its howling. Hermione fell back against the pillows, her chest heaving, her vision swimming with black spots. She strained her ears, listening for the sound, the cry, the life. There was nothing. "Draco," she whispered, the name a broken prayer. She tried to lift her head. Draco was standing at the foot of the bed. He was holding a bundle wrapped in a transfigured blanket. He was completely still. His back was to the candlelight, his face in shadow. "Draco." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the exhaustion. "Is he?" Draco turned slowly. He walked towards the head of the bed. His movements were hesitant, as if he were carrying a bomb. He sat down on the edge of the mattress. He looked down at the bundle in his arms. He looked terrified. Then, a small, disgruntled sound broke the silence. A cough, and then a thin, high-pitched wail that rose in volume until it filled the room. Hermione let out a sob of relief that racked her entire body. "Give him to me." Draco hesitated. He looked at the screaming infant, then at Hermione. For a second, she saw the conflict warring in his eyes, the urge to run, to protect the child from himself, versus the pull of the bond. The bond won. He lowered the bundle into her arms. Hermione looked down. Scorpius was tiny. He was red and wrinkled and furious. He had a tuft of pale, almost white blonde hair on his head. But when he opened his eyes, blinking against the light, they weren't grey. They were brown, warm, golden, honey brown. Hermione laughed, crying at the same time. She ran a finger down his impossibly soft cheek. "He has my eyes." Draco was watching them. He looked like he had been hollowed out. He reached out a trembling finger and touched the baby's fist. Scorpius's hand opened and closed around Draco's finger, gripping it with surprising strength. The magic in the room settled. The vinculum changed. The burning, desperate pull that had defined their lives for 9 months evaporated. The wire didn't snap. It simply dissolved. The urgency was gone, the survival mode deactivated. Hermione felt the loss of it immediately. The space in her chest where Draco's magic had lived was suddenly empty. She looked up at him, panic fluttering in her throat. "I can't feel you," she whispered. Draco looked at her. His face was unreadable, closed off. He slowly pulled his finger from the baby's grip. "The contract is fulfilled," he said softly. He stood up. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it felt like miles. He looked at the picture they made. Hermione, flushed and alive, holding the heir to the Malfoy name. "Draco, don't," Hermione said, sensing the retreat. "Please." "You should sleep," he said, his voice reverting to that cool aristocrat drawl. "I'll have the elves bring potions and food." "Stay," she pleaded. "Just stay." "I can't," he said. He looked at the door. "The crisis is over. You're safe. He's safe." He looked back at her one last time. There was no hatred in his eyes, but there was no warmth either. There was only a profound, crushing sadness. "I have to go before I ruin it," he whispered. He turned and walked out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, quieter this time. Hermione was left alone in the massive bed, clutching the baby to her chest. The fire crackled comfortably in the grate. The storm outside had passed. The manor was silent. But for the first time in months, the silence wasn't a comfort. It was just empty. She looked down at Scorpius, who had fallen asleep, his thumb in his mouth. "It's just us now," she whispered to him, tears sliding hot and fast down her cheeks. But as she shifted, she saw something on the bedside table. Draco's wand. He had left it behind in his panic. Or perhaps he had left it on purpose. Hermione reached out and touched the hawthorn wood. It was still warm from his hand, and deep within the wood, faint but undeniable, she felt a pulse, a heartbeat. It wasn't the vinculum. It wasn't the forced bond of the ritual. It was just him, and he hadn't gone far. The silence that followed the birth was not the heavy, suffocating weight of the ritual, nor was it the predatory quiet of the manor waiting for blood. It was a new kind of silence, fragile, glass-like. The kind of silence that hangs in the air after a cathedral bell has stopped tolling, where the vibration still hums in the marrow of the bone. 2 days had passed. Hermione sat on the edge of the emerald-draped bed in the west wing. Her trunk was packed. It sat by the door, a dark, accusing block of leather against the pale stone walls. In her arms, Scorpius slept. He was a small, warm weight, wrapped in a blanket of soft grey wool. He was terrifyingly real. For 9 months he had been a magical abstraction, a terrifying clause in a blood contract. Now he was a boy. He had eyelashes that lay flat against his cheeks, fingers that curled into microscopic fists, and a heartbeat that beat its own rhythm, independent of hers, independent of Draco's. The sanguis vinculum was gone. Hermione felt the absence of it like a phantom limb. The constant, thrumming connection to Draco's emotional state, the silver wire that had allowed her to feel his fear and his strength, had evaporated the moment the child took his first breath. She was alone in her head again. It was quiet. It was lonely. The door handle turned. Hermione stiffened, her hold on the baby tightening instinctively. Draco entered. He had rebuilt the walls. He was dressed in immaculate black robes, buttoned high to the throat, hiding every inch of skin. His hair was slicked back, severe and sharp. The dark circles under his eyes were the only evidence of the ordeal, but his expression was composed, frozen in the haughty, distant mask of the Malfoy patriarch. He didn't look at the bed. He didn't look at the bundle in her arms. He walked straight to the small writing desk by the window and placed a stack of parchment on it. "The port key is arranged for noon," he said. His voice was cool, polished, devoid of the gravel and grit that had been there during the labor. "It will take you to a property in Gascony. It is unplottable, secure. The deed has been transferred to your name." Hermione didn't move. She watched him arrange the papers with unnecessary precision. "Gascony," she repeated flatly. "It's far," Draco said, finally turning to face her. He kept his hands clasped behind his back. "Far from the ministry, far from the press, and far from here." "And the custody arrangements?" "Full custody to you," he said quickly, as if he had rehearsed the line 1,000 times. "I have set up a vault for his education and maintenance. It is substantial. You will never need to work again. You will never need to ask for anything." "I see," Hermione said. She looked down at Scorpius. The baby stirred, letting out a soft sigh. "You've been very thorough. A clean break, a completed transaction." Draco's jaw tightened. "It is the only logical conclusion. The ritual is complete. The line is preserved. The danger to your life has passed." "Has it?" Hermione looked up, meeting his grey gaze. "And what about the danger to him?" "He is safer with you," Draco said, his voice cracking slightly before he clamped it down. "He is safer away from this house, away from the magic that created him, away from me." "You keep saying that," Hermione murmured, standing up slowly. Her body was still sore, still healing, but she felt a fierce, burning strength rising in her chest. "You keep treating yourself like a contagion, Draco, like a disease we need to be quarantined from." "Because I am," he snapped, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "Look at how he was made, Granger. He was forged in pain. He was ripped out of you by a curse. Do you think I want him to look at me one day and know that his existence was a violation?" "His existence was a survival choice," Hermione corrected him, stepping closer. "And he won't look at you and see a violation. He will look at you and see his father." Draco took a step back, his back hitting the cold stone of the window frame. He looked panicked. "I cannot be a father. My father was a monster. His father was a tyrant. The blood is bad, Hermione. It is poisoned." "Then dilute it," she said. She stopped inches from him. The distance between them was no longer bridged by magic. There was no golden light, no heat transfer, just the cold air of the room and the scent of him, cedar, parchment, and the lingering, sharp smell of fear. "He has my eyes," Hermione whispered. "You saw them. He has my blood too. He isn't just a Malfoy heir, Draco. He's a rewriting of the history you hate so much." Draco looked down at the bundle. He looked torn, a man standing on a bridge, staring at the water, deciding whether to jump. "I can't," he whispered. "I don't know how to love him without destroying him." "You kept me alive," Hermione said softly. "For months. You fed me your magic. You held me when the pain was too much. You stayed in this room and watched me sleep to make sure I didn't fade. Was that just the contract, Draco? Was that just the ritual?" He looked away, staring out the window at the grey, desolate grounds. "The ritual is a powerful thing. It mimics emotion. It forces dependency." The ritual is gone, she said. I can't feel you anymore. The silence, it's deafening. Draco closed his eyes. Good. You should be free of it. But I'm still standing here, she said, and you haven't thrown me out yet. The port key is at noon, he reminded her, but his voice lacked conviction. Hermione looked at the papers on the desk. The deed to a safe life. A life without complications. A life where she could pretend this dark, gothic interlude never happened. She could raise Scorpius in the sun, tell him his father was a war hero who died, or a shadow who vanished. It would be easy. She shifted Scorpius to one arm and reached out with her free hand. She picked up the parchment. Draco watched her, his body tense, waiting for her to take the exit he had built for her. Hermione looked at the heavy seal of the Malfoy crest at the bottom of the page. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, she tore the parchment in half, then in quarters. She let the pieces flutter to the floor like snow. Draco stared at the scraps of paper. What are you doing? I am not going to Gascony, she said, and I am not raising him alone. You don't get to buy your way out of this guilt, Malfoy. You don't get to be the tragic martyr in the empty castle. Hermione, you helped make him, she said, her voice hard, uncompromising. You help raise him. That is the contract I'm offering. No magic, no blood binding, just a choice. A choice? He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. To stay here, in this gloom, with me? Yes. Why? He looked at her, searching her face for the logic he knew she prized. Why would you choose this? Hermione looked down at the baby. Scorpius had woken up. He was blinking his honey-brown eyes, staring up at the shadows of the room. Because, she said softly, looking back at Draco. Because when the magic left, I missed it. And I don't think it was just the magic. The admission hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. It wasn't a confession of love. It wasn't a promise of romance. It was an acknowledgement of the scar they shared. They had been fused together, burned and remade, and separating them now felt like tearing a stitch before the wound was healed. Draco stared at her. His mask had crumbled completely. He looked young and terrified and achingly lonely. I will hurt you, he warned. I am moody. I am damaged. I wake up screaming. I know, she said. I have nightmares too. We can scream together. She stepped forward, closing the final inch of distance. She held the baby out to him. Take him, she commanded. Hermione, take your son, Draco. He hesitated. His hands shook. He looked at his own hands as if they were weapons. But slowly, driven by a force that had nothing to do with ancient runes and everything to do with the human heart, he reached out. He took the weight. Scorpius settled into the crook of his arm as if he had always belonged there. Draco looked down. The baby stared back, serious and calm. Draco let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a year. His shoulders slumped. The rigid posture of the Lord of the Manor collapsed into the weary slouch of a father. He's heavy, Draco whispered. Legacy usually is, Hermione replied. She reached out and touched Draco's arm. There was no spark, no rush of golden power, no invasion of thoughts, just the warmth of wool and the solid heat of a human body. It was quiet. It was mundane. It was perfect. Draco didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch just slightly, a millimeter of surrender. I won't fix the West Wing, he said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the baby. It's too cold. The East Wing is warmer, Hermione suggested. And closer to the library. I suppose, he murmured. And the elves. They will need instructions. He can't eat what we eat. We'll figure it out, she said. We have no idea what we're doing, he said, looking at her then. The grey eyes were clear, no longer clouded by the ritual's haze. No, Hermione agreed, but we're alive. Draco looked back at the window, at the winter landscape that was slowly, imperceptibly beginning to thaw. For now, he said. For now, she echoed. He didn't kiss her. He didn't promise her forever. He simply shifted the baby to his shoulder, turned, and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, looking back at her. Are you coming? He asked. Hermione looked at the torn papers on the floor, then at the man standing in the doorway. The enemy, the survivor, the father. Yes, she said. She followed him out of the room, into the dim corridor of Malfoy Manor. The shadows were still deep, and the ghosts were still watching. But as they walked together into the quiet dark, the silence didn't feel like an ending. It felt, for the first time, like a beginning. The end.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for listening to this story. Writing this was very emotional for me. It is not a typical romance. There are no flowers and no date. This is a story about survival. I wanted to explore a difficult question. Can two enemies become a family? Not because they want to, but because they have to. In this story, Draco and Hermione are broken. The magic forces them together, but in the end they made a choice. They choose to stay. To me, that is real love. It is not always perfect. Sometimes love is just holding someone's hand in the dark so they are not alone. I hope you felt their pain and their hope. Thank you for spending this time with me. It means the world to me. See you in the next story.